if you could create anything, if you had a magic wand, what would the best prioritization system look like? And you'd probably say, okay, we want a model that takes into account all of the prior data that we have.
Hello and welcome to another coffee break episode on the Conversion Podcast, where we provide easy to digest and easily to apply insights on digital experimentation, conversion optimization, and customer experience in the time it takes to grab a coffee.
Thank you very much for making time for this today. Really appreciate it, and welcome to the podcast.
Of course, my pleasure.
Nice. Okay, well, teeing this one up for you, and taking a little bit of inspiration of, I think, a pretty highly valuable topic I've heard you talk about in the past is actually around something that maybe people would think is kind of boring or maybe somewhat overlooked, is really looking at prioritization through the lens of like running an experimentation program. And I think something controversial I've heard you say before, or at least a different of opinion, is that it's probably actually one of the most like overlooked levers for driving like overall like program performance. And so maybe with that, I'll just kind of tee that up with just what is prioritization in the context of experimentation and kind of some of your viewpoints of like how you can use it to really drive impact.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know how controversial it is, but I think it's certainly overlooked. The reason for that, I think, is the best thing and the worst thing about experimentation, about conversion optimization, is anyone can come up with ideas for things to test. Like you can talk to anyone within the business, and they will have ideas for how you might improve the website or the product. You can probably talk to their families, and they will have ideas too. So there's never any shortage of good ideas to test. But what you do have a shortage of is traffic, people to design and build and run the tests and analyze them as well. So there are always constraints in your experimentation program. So you can only ever run a fraction of the ideas that you want to test. And that means that you have to be really careful in terms of what you do and don't run. If you can only run 20 experiments or 100 experiments in a year, you have to make sure that you're doing the right ones and also that you're doing them in the right order, that you learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So that's where prioritization comes in. And a lot of people like skip over it, or they prioritize based on gut instinct, and I think that's doing it a disservice.
And so I think it's maybe funny to also comment on that. You mentioned like 100 tests, which I think for some people is like, wow, that's a ton of experiments. But even I think as you start building or scaling to 100 experiments, it's amazing how quickly a lot of ideas can still get absorbed, and you still actually do have to make a ton of trade-offs in which test you're running.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially like every time you complete an experiment, the likelihood is that that spawns two or three ideas.
Yeah.
Like if it crashes and burns, or if it is successful, there'll be other ideas that you want to do off the back of that. So if everything that you're doing is spawning multiple new ideas, then you're never going to run out of ideas. There's always that kind of backlog that you have to get through.
Okay. Can you maybe talk about how people traditionally approach like prioritizing things, and then maybe off the back of that, how through conversions like evolved its thinking over time with that as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I started in experimentation almost 20 years ago now. And I think when I started out, and a lot of people today, they have a kind of a simplified view of prioritization. At the heart of it is normally, there's a few different flavors, but at the heart of it is normally two different axes. So you've got the impact on one axis, and you've got the ease on the other axis. So if you imagine that making four quadrants, then essentially you've got high impact ideas, the ones that are going to be super impactful, and they're also easy to run, easy to design, easy to build, easy to get stakeholder approval for. These are the ones that you should be prioritizing first. And then in the diagonally opposite quadrant, you've got the lower impact ideas that are going to be a pain in the ass to build or run. So you've got the high impact, high ease, and low impact, low ease. And so that's typically how people prioritize. The problem is that most people will have a fairly good idea on the ease axis. Like you can look at an experiment and say, okay, this is just a simple copy change. It's going to be very easy to run, or this is much more complex. Like we're talking about redesigning the entire shopping cart. That's going to be a low ease experiment. Like everyone can estimate ease relatively accurately, but what people struggle to do is to estimate the impact. And I mean, ultimately, that's kind of why we're running the tests in the first place, is to see what that impact, if anything, is. but also people have huge biases, and people become very subjective about ideas, and they tend to um, essentially vote for which ideas do we think are going to be the most impactful. And people's bias is typically to favour their own ideas instead of other people's, and so it becomes super subjective, and it kind of invalidates a lot of the prioritization model before you've even got started. So it makes it really challenging to do that effectively.
Yeah, I would say I'm definitely traditionally guilty of this too, right? Like you get very excited about your own idea as well, and you want to, I think there's that endowment effect. You get very attached to it. You want to see it fly. You want to see the result. And so,
Yeah.
yeah. How about then is like what to do about it? Like if that's the case, how do you actually overcome that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think people have recognized that that's a very subjective approach. And so there have been various approaches over the years that have tried to make prioritization, in particular on that impact side, more objective. So there are different approaches to do that. People will say, can you score a concept according to a number of different questions, like, does it change an element that's above the fold? Because if it does, then it's probably going to be more impactful than one that doesn't. And how noticeable is it? Like, can you see that change within 5 seconds? Um, and so on. So you can come up with these kind of questions, and they can score either like a 1 or a 0 or whatever to try and add some level of objectivity to it. But ultimately, it makes it really hard to do that accurately still. And typically, you get two problems. One, people try to game the system, like they try to create an experiment that ticks all of those boxes, but actually they start to forget the user problem that they were solving in the first place. But second, and probably more importantly, is a system like that doesn't necessarily leverage the pre-existing data and insight that you have that should naturally be part of a prioritization model. So if suppose we run an experiment today and it's really effective, if we run a similar experiment, an iteration of that in 2 weeks' time, the fact that the experiment today was successful should mean that we prioritize the next experiment even more. So if you've got a very kind of objective, kind of static, crude model asking you a bunch of yes/no questions, it can be hard to take factors like that into account. So there are ways to fix it, but at the heart of it, you still have to think like, what would if you could create anything, if you had a magic wand, what would the best prioritization system look like? And you'd probably say, okay, we want a model that takes into account all of the prior data that we have, not just from experiments that we've run on this website, but if you're an agency, let's take insights from all of the experiments that we've run. Let's take that insight from all of the research that we've run, and then use that to prioritize a concept based on that prior data.
And I think the fascinating thing about this is I know I've been around a little bit, so I'll just say from behind the scenes that that's something we've been trying to tackle to a certain degree. But I think like the original question of like that was like, okay, we actually can gather a lot of data, but how do we actually combine it in some way or analyze it in some way that it's going to be useful or organized for future use?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I think the challenge in terms of analyzing that data, in particular, analyzing that data at scale, is it becomes very hard to determine essentially what was tested and why.
Yeah.
So typically, when people are writing like an experiment plan or a summary, they might detail out their hypothesis and they'll talk about the results. But typically, those are written as free text, and if there are fields that they can enter, they tend to be fairly rudimentary. Like, what is the KPI? What's the metric that we were measuring for this experiment? It becomes harder to think about, what is the underlying hypothesis for this experiment? Why did we decide to run this? Because ultimately, that's what we need to be learning from when we're prioritizing future experiments. But it becomes really hard to do that at scale. Like, suppose we did a test on a e-commerce website. One person might say, okay, let's label this as a free shipping test. Someone else might label it as delivery. Someone else might think about it in terms of pricing strategy, for example. Like, there are multiple different ways of labeling the same experiment, and that makes it really challenging when you're looking in terms of meta-analysis at hundreds or thousands of experiments, even, because you need a consistent way of talking about these experiments so that you can then gather that insight at scale, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And so being that I think especially maybe the concept of meta-analysis, I think something that gets thrown around a lot as a term. You think of like hierarchy of evidence, and like that is a very like maybe theoretical approach, but then how do you actually put that into practice? And maybe I'll kind of tee that up of like, what are the elements that are needed then to actually take advantage of something like that in terms of we do the analysis, but then we can do like a larger analysis on all the analysis that we've done across like a whole range of experiments.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the way that we approach that at Conversion is we will tag every experiment that we run and every experiment that we have run in the past. So we kind of did this big catch up exercise to kind of go back over hundreds, if not thousands of experiments and kind of tag them retrospectively. But we tag them based on pretty much as many categories as you can think of in terms of what industry was this client in, what kind of page we run the experiment on. Was it on a product details page or a listing page or a shopping cart, or was it on a SaaS company's landing page? What kind of page was it that we were testing? What was the industry? But we also focused in particular on the type of change that we were making, not just is it image or copy or functionality or whatever, but we focused on what is the kind of principle, the behavioral principle that we're trying to leverage in this experiment. And so that's when we started talking about this idea of levers in particular. So the lever being, if you distill a hypothesis down to a couple of words, what's the principle that we're trying to leverage in this experiment? And previously we'd talk about levers in terms of experiments, but what we then built is this idea of a lever framework. So rather than two people describing the same experiment in two different ways, we had a lever framework which tries to, it does present a taxonomy of levers. So we start with a kind of primary level of levers. So in terms of things like cost and trust and usability and comprehension and so on. And then underneath each of those primary levers, we have secondary levers. And underneath those, we have tertiary levers. So what that allows us to do is to very quickly drill down and say, okay, this experiment is focused on trust. Within trust, it's focused on security. And within security, it's focused on payment security, for example. So we can get really narrow on one particular experiment. And then that way we tag all of the other similar experiments with that same lever. And then over time, we build up a really clear idea in terms of which of those levers are successful in general, and also which of those levers are successful for a financial services client or a travel client or a retail site, for example. But we can also see how those levers change in terms of their success over time as well. So by doing that lever framework that sits at the heart, it means we've built up a huge amount of data that is then applicable to future experiments that we run.
Yeah. I think the comment I might also pull out there is just, do you have any advice on, okay, maybe a listener here actually has run quite a few experiments. They have all of these in a PowerPoint deck somewhere, but they've never done anything in terms of like actually trying to tag these up, unlock them, look at them in aggregate. Like how would you recommend they go about doing that?
It's a good question. I think when we started doing this was a few years ago now, it was a very manual process. I think there are ways that you can improve that. You can leverage AI to support, obviously, in doing that. And I think that's been a really effective technique. We've introduced technology that we've made available publicly. We don't just promote the lever framework as something that we think would benefit a huge number of people, but we also created a tool that lets people essentially type in, like, this is what the experiment does. Which lever is most effective is the appropriate one to choose for this experiment. So when people are looking to do this themselves, we've seen a lot of companies get a lot of success by going through the past experiments, and particularly in prioritizing ones that have a statistically significant result, because that cuts it down right away. But obviously there's a benefit in doing all of the experiments and then tagging them accordingly and building up that database of prior knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. I think there is a little tool of that. We'll just link it in the notes too. I think like levers.ai if anyone wanted to check that out. Just the last thing here, I think that's very related to this, and maybe the one thing to take us home for this episode. There's been a vision that we've discussed and think about, and I think everyone gets very excited of, is this idea of going back to your comment of a model that's dynamic. It's constantly like updating and getting to the theoretical idea of like, could we automatically prioritize a backlog of tests or a backlog of ideas? I'm curious to just get your opinion on like, what does that vision look like for a listener? And then how far are we along the journey to like reality of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that we built a product that does that a couple of years ago now called Confidence AI. And essentially we built that with the idea that we want to be able to leverage all of this prior data that we have on experiments. We know which levers are successful by industry, but what we still struggle to do is when you've got a backlog of 100 or 200 experiments, how do you prioritize that based on all of that prior data? And importantly, how do you continue to update that priority? Because obviously, as you start running more and more tests, you learn more and more about your customers, and your prioritization should change accordingly. So that's why we created this product called Confidence AI. The idea of this is it takes into account all of the data that we know about this particular website that we're optimizing, but also a wider set of data from multiple other thousands and thousands of experiments that we've run previously. And it uses that to essentially give a score for every concept in the backlog out of 100 in terms of the confidence that we have that that experiment is going to be successful. And what this allows us to do then is to say, okay, based on what we know has been successful in the past, these are the concepts that we think we should prioritize. So what it isn't, and I think a lot of people in the industry kind of get upset with this idea that we're leveraging prior data. What it isn't is a way to kind of bypass research and ideation and experimentation even. It is a way to support that prioritization step, which is so critical. And obviously, the nature of it is Confidence AI doesn't get it right every single time. Sometimes it thinks a concept will be successful and it isn't, and vice versa. But then that's ultimately how it learns. So over time, it gets more and more accurate. So it means that we can get better and better in terms of our approach to prioritization. But I think it's worth emphasizing there's still some manual intervention, because you might see, for example, that the top 5 ideas rated by Confidence AI are all clustered around a similar theme, a similar lever. You wouldn't necessarily want to run all 5 of those in parallel or back to back even. You might want to spread your bets, like at the roulette table in Vegas, rather than clustering all of your bets around one particular corner of the table, you might spread them around a bit. I appreciate the kind of the Vegas analogy is maybe not the right one, because it doesn't really matter too much where you place your bets. But I know that one example that was shared a few years ago was one analogy was around the idea of Minesweeper. When you're placing your bets, you want to kind of dot them around a little bit until you see, okay, this is where the battleship is, and then when you've got a hit, then that's when you explore around it. We want to take that similar idea to how we think about prioritization here. We leverage AI to inform, but it doesn't dictate to us.
Yeah, I've definitely stolen the battleship analogy from you in the past, but I think definitely the combination of the human and AI, or human and technology, that I think that's the big unlock that we're already seeing gains from, and I think it's just only going to accelerate from here from our perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. I stole the analogy from Brian Balfour.
Okay. Well,
I think like 10 years ago.
I think they're all stolen, so that's fair. Don't feel too bad. Well, I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you so much for this. I think we'll add some links below if people want to dive into this topic a little bit more. I think there's tons of applicability that you can just take right off the bat here. And thank you once again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.